Now, last but not least, there is one other feature that you can use in directives, which you should know about. Because you can inject services or, in general, things into your directives, just as you can use dependency injection in components. It's no difference in directives. And you could inject any service of your choice here, like the auth service, but you can also actually inject the host element or a reference to that host element, just as you saw it earlier for components as well, in case you want to get access to that host element. And that's what I'll do here. I'll add a new private property, which I'll name host element ref. The name, of course, is up to you. And I'll then use this inject function. Alternatively, we could use the constructor for injecting it. And I'll inject an element ref here, like this, which is imported from Angular Core. Now that's the same approach we used in a component to inject the host element of that component, or a reference to that host element. It's the same approach here. Now I want to give Angular, or TypeScript to be precise, some extra information about the type of host element this directive will be used on. And that's why inject actually is a generic function where you can use these angle brackets to provide some extra type information to it. In this case, I can tell TypeScript which kind of value will be available in this host element ref property after this was injected. And what will be available here will be an element ref, but that in turn, as you learned, is a wrapper object around the host element type object. And therefore element ref also takes angle brackets so that we can define which kind of value will be wrapped by this element ref wrapper object. And here that will be an HTML anchor element, because we know that this directive is used on an anchor element. So when we inject the host element, that will be an HTML anchor element type of value. Well, and with that, we could use this host element ref here instead of event target in our onConfirmedLeave page method here. So there we could use this host element ref native element ref, and also use this to update the ref before we leave the page. So we can use this injected host element reference. And with that, if we reload, if I click here and I confirm this, this still works the way it did before. This query parameter is still being added, but now with help of the injected host element. And that therefore hopefully gives you a good idea of what you can do with attribute directives and when you might want to build a custom attribute directive. Though I'll also say it right away that in most Angular applications, you will probably only build a few attribute directives and you'll mostly work with components instead. Directives are a key Angular feature, but they're not a feature you're going to use all the time. Instead, the main feature really are components. Nonetheless, directives matter, and this here was just one type of directive. Next, let's build a custom structural directive. So we built a custom attribute directive. Next, I want to build a custom structural directive, and I want to build a custom structural directive that makes rendering content based on user status even easier than with this if statement or the ngIf directive. For that, I'll create a new directive, and I will now do that with help of the CLI and name this directive auth directive. And it should be generated in the auth folder, which is why I will add this auth folder prefix in front of the name so that it's added in this folder here. I will also add -- skip - tests so that the extra testing file isn't generated. And yep, that should be NGGD. So with that, we have this auth directive TypeScript file, and as you see, that gives us a class with the decorator, which has this selector here, which is quite convenient. Now, what do we want to do in this directive? How do we want to use it? Well, in the end, the idea is that we can use it on some element that should be rendered conditionally. So for example, here on this paragraph. And I want to be able to add my app auth directive here and then set the type of user for which this element should be shown on the screen. For example, admin or guest or user. These are the three types of users this application supports. So in this case, it would be admin. That's kind of how I want to be able to use this. Though since it'll be a structural directive, we'll need to add an asterisk here, but I'll get back to this later. Therefore, back in this auth directive TypeScript file, we will definitely need to accept an input because we need that user for which we want to show the element on which this directive is added. We need that user type as an input here. So I'll add a property called user type and set up an input with help of the input function, though again, you could of course also use the input decorator. Here, I'll set this to be a required input, though, because this directive needs to know for which user the content should be shown. This is some required information. And the kind of value I want to get through that input should be of type permission, which is a type I set up in my auth model file, which is in the end this union type here, which combines 3 string literal values for the allowed values that I want to take here. So that's the first step. The next important building block is that we need to find out which kind of user is currently logged in. And that's some information that's managed by the auth service. There, whenever the user authenticates, we update this active permission signal. Now, I mentioned before that you can inject services into directives, and that is therefore what I'll do here. I'll inject the auth service with help of the inject function, like this. Alternatively, we could use the constructor, as you learned. And we can then use this service to find out which kind of user is currently logged in. But what do we do with that information now? Well, now here in the constructor, we can use the effect function, which is provided by Angular, about which you also learned earlier in the course, to run some code whenever some signal value changes. And here I want to run some code whenever the user permission changes or whenever this input value here changes. So we pass a function to this effect function. This will be the code that should be executed. And in there, I want to check if this auth service active permission, if I read that signal value, I want to check if that is equal to this user type, so to this input signal value here. If that is equal, I know that the element on which this directive is added should be shown. So for now, I'll just console log show element. Else, it should be removed from the DOM, because else we have a user that's not of the type of user for which this element on which this directive is added should be shown. So here I'll log do not show element. And since we're using effect, Angular will set up subscriptions for active permission and user type and re-execute that code whenever either of these two signal values changes, so that this code will run again and again as the active user's permission status changes. So if you save that and you go back to the app component HTML file, you can add app auth, this directive here, to this paragraph. But then there we actually need to set a different kind of input because here I named it user type. But we can use the same trick as before and assign an alias so that we can use the directive selector attribute as a directly bindable input for this directive, whilst internally using a more descriptive property name. With that, we can bind the app_auth property on this paragraph where we add this directive, and we can set it to a hard-coded string like admin here, so that this element should only be shown for admins. Though at the moment it will always be shown because at the moment we're just logging something to the console. But with all that, if we save that and reload, we don't see anything here. Nothing new, at least. And we don't get any new output here because whilst we did create this directive, Angular isn't aware of it yet. You need to register it since it's a standalone directive. So in the component where you want to use it, in this case the app component, you need to add it to the imports array. So here we need to add the auth directive and also add this import. With that, if you save that, you now see do not show element here because initially the user is not logged in as an admin. But if I now, for example, enter admin@example.com, admin, and click login, you see show element gets logged. So this directive seems to work, but of course it's not yet changing the DOM. And therefore at the moment it's still an attribute directive, not a structural directive, because it's not changing the structure of the DOM yet. But that's what will change as a next step.